Hello and welcome to our advanced seminar for Urban Footprint. Today we're taking a deep dive at custom building and place types. All right, so for those of you joining us today, today's seminar is great for those of you that have had some time at Urban Footprint, have some experience under your belt, but now you're seeking to either grow that experience or you want to customize the types that you use so that you can be more exacting in your paint scenarios, in your development scenarios that you're using as you go through Urban Footprint. As you know, these seminars are a mixture of both lecture and interactive exercises. So you want to be logged into Urban Footprint during the seminar so that you can work through these projects as well. For today, we will be going through the full functionality of the Built Forms Manager. So we'll be looking at all the components that are part of the Built Form Manager, including components themselves, building types, place types, and then also give you some advice on how best to utilize them and go through an example of applying that knowledge in a project. Get ourselves a little bit oriented with the Built Form Manager. So with the Built Form Manager, we'll go through this orientation and understand where the manager is, how to use it to customize your projects, and get a full understanding of the concept of built forms. The Built Form Manager is located and accessed through the Manage button that's on the left side of your screen as you shift through all the modes. So those of you that are familiar, obviously, with Urban Footprint know that there are 4 main modes that you can go through in Urban Footprint. And the 5th button down on the left side of the mode shift area there, the mode menu area, is the Manage mode. When you select the Manage mode, it brings you into the interface for managing built forms in Manage mode. So you'll see as you shift through the mode bar there, you'll see the options that come about. The first option to be familiar with when you're in the built forms mode is to see the built forms menu. So that's at the top of your screen, and that allows you to shift through the different options that you will be working with in the Built Forms Manager. We'll go through each of these different functions in more detail as we go through this training, but just to get you to have some orientation around the functionality and the usability of the Built Form Manager, we wanted to make sure you knew where that was. After that, it's the Built Form list. So depending on what form you're looking at, either components, building types, or place types, you'll have access to the Built Forms list. This includes all the forms that are included in Urban Footprint by default, but then also as you add forms within your specific project, you'll have access to them in this list here. When you're in the Built Form Manager, you have a couple of different ways that you access information, or different places that you access this information. We call them the Built Form cards. There are 2 different types of Built Form cards, either those that are derived, so the ones that have information that are provided based on calculations that are made for characteristics that you've provided, and then ones that are editable. And these are the Built Form cards that you can make changes to yourself when a card isn't locked and you have access to that information. And we'll go through with more detail some explanation on when a card's locked or when it's available for you to make edits. So what is a built form? Built form in Urban Footprint consists of 3 different types of forms. There are components, building types, and place types. And each of these have their specific functionality and can consist of different makeups and house the characteristics that you want to give to built forms that you'll either be painting with or creating as you move through the build process. So we'll go into these in detail. The first element that we want to look at is components. So with components, we'll review and have an understanding of the role of components and the attributes of components. So you'll understand what you can and can't change and why you might want to make decisions to make changes to components as you go through and work with the built form manager. The first thing to know about components is that they are the building block of elements in the built form manager in UrbanFootprint. Now, components can be an element of single family housing. It can be an element of multifamily housing, of, um, of, of multiple story buildings, or even things like civic spaces and parks and things of that nature. But within components, you assign attributes to these components. This can be something like land use designation, FAR, so floor area ratio, how much of the component is residential versus non-residential. And you make all these decisions and assign these attributes and characteristics to your component with the understanding that they will be the building block for any of the other elements that you make throughout UrbanFootprint. Now, these concepts of attributes carry through the other built form types, so building types and place types, but they all come down to these single elements or these single ideas that are a part or contributed to components. And so understanding the attributes and the decisions you make with the attributes when you are creating or editing components means that you'll be able to move that up and scale that up when you work with either building types or place types. So with that understanding, the next step is to get a better, get some more clarity around building types. So building types are the next step up from components. So in our next session, we'll have a better understanding of the different role of building types, the scale of building types, and when it's applicable to use. So building types are a collection of components that we pull together to get the kind of characteristics that we'd like to see for our building types that we use in painting. In this example, we have a single family component that is 100% or consists of 100% of the building type. So the component attributes that we've decided upon for this example of single family housing makes up 100% of the single family or attribute in the building type. So when we paint with this building type, we're getting exactly the attributes that we have created in the component and having that applied to something that's paintable with the building type, since you paint with building types and place types and not with component types. However, building types can be made up of multiple components so that you can get a blend of characteristics across the building type. So here you can see that the building type is still a single family home or a single family house, but it consists of a percentage or a distribution and allocation of the different building type components that we have available to us. So you can see that there's differences in densities, differences in parking allocation, differences in site coverage and lot coverage that are a part of the different components. And all of these differences are blended into a single building type that we've decided to use specifically for our project. And so it's labeled as Berkeley single family. So with that understanding of building types, now the next step up is to get a better understanding of place types. So through this next section, we'll have an understanding of the role of place types, understand the scale of place types, and then once again, discuss the applicability of place types. So place types are a combination of building types, and also you can use components directly in place types as well. The additional element to keep in mind or to consider when creating place types is that you also have to assign or allocate and make decisions on how right-of-way will be distributed. This allows you to create and paint over a larger scale and have the right-of-way and some of those other elements that are important to consider when you're working at a larger scale be attributed to and included in your place type. You can see in this example here that this place type includes a handful of different building types. So high-rise apartments, civic spaces, single-family housing, parks and religious centers, and these all come together in different mixes and attributes, in addition to decisions about the right-of-way. So whether or not we're using neighborhood roads, smaller arterial roads, major collector roads, and how much of our space is allocated to right-of-way versus building types. And this all comes together to create a place type. So when you have this place type and you're painting with this place type across a large area, these decisions and these attributes, these characteristics have already been included in your place type, making it efficient and quick for you to paint with place types. You can see here an example of the decision making when creating or evaluating an existing or new place type. You can see that 90% of the net area is dedicated, 90 plus is dedicated to building space. So as we mentioned, the high-rise apartments, the civic spaces, green space as well. And then less than 10, so in this case, 7% is allocated to the right-of-way. So this kind of reflects a typical space or a neighborhood level or regional level allocation of space in your project area. And in addition to that, you can further differentiate how these spaces are allocated. So in this example, the majority of our right-of-way space is dedicated to local roads, and only a small percentage of it is dedicated to either arterials or collectors. You can see that there's a good amount of distribution across all the different building types. So this represents a good mixed allocation to a place type that you could then use to paint when you're making changes to your projects and your project scenarios. So now that we have a better understanding of the different elements that are part of the built form manager, so you remember we went through components, we went through building types and then place types. It's good to take a step now and determine how to apply these built forms. And also understand when it makes sense to create your own custom built forms versus using the ones that are default in the Urban Footprint library, which already includes a good number of building and place types and components as well that you can use in your projects. And so when we're done with this, you'll have a better understanding of how built forms are useful and when to apply what's available or create your own. So as we described in our review of building types and place types, building types are essentially the net area, so the parcel. So if you're dealing with a location or you're working at a scale in which you just want to change for the sake of scenario planning and creating some alternative scenarios that you want to evaluate, you just want to change the building types that are on the ground. You think that the urban fabric, the right-of-way, the road network, those types of things won't change too much, or the location of civic spaces, green spaces, that type of thing is already in place, and you just want to allocate some changes to the building areas themselves, then using the building type is probably the appropriate scale to go at. Now, if you're making wholesale changes and you want to change across an entire gross area as opposed to the net area, so you're envisioning changes that might involve changes to the right-of-way alignments, reallocation or creation of green spaces, the addition of civic spaces, changes on this scale, and you want to get a better sense of how these wholesale changes could impact the project area that you're looking at, then you might want to consider working with place types. So that'll make it efficient for you to change an entire area and not have to be too concerned about working within the constraints or the confinements of the existing place as it is. And so this is how you conceptualize the hierarchy of all these different types. Components are parts of building types are parts of place types. And obviously, as we said earlier, your components could directly contribute to a place type, but they all nest within one another and help you to understand how to apply them as you're working through your project development, or if you're creating new types to use in your project. And this is another visual representation of that, of how all these different components and attributes fit into one another. And so now that we have an understanding of the hierarchy, we want to take a look at our ability to paint and apply these types of types in our projects. One last element of understanding that you'll want to have is a look at the library settings. So when you are working in the built form library, you have access to an understanding of all the different characteristics that go into the types that you are evaluating. So there's some default inputs. Those are things that, as the name would imply, that are just a part of the physical attributes of the structure that are pre-populated for you. Variables are dynamic inputs like population and employment. So UrbanFootprint provides a set understanding or a set starting point for population and employment area information. But if you're able to if you have a deeper understanding of how population utilizes built space in your community or your project, or you want to try to include that in your project development, then you're able to make those changes to those variables and have it reflected in the outcome for the projects that you create. And just an understanding that when you make changes, it alters the assumptions of what the characteristics are, and you'll want to make changes and apply changes before you start using all of these types, because these changes are what these assumptions are what UrbanFootprint uses to create outputs and to assess the outcome of these changes. So you'll want to have these well planned in advance. We'll look at how to make these changes. We'll actually go through this in our demonstration to give you some more hands-on experience of how to make changes and how to edit the built form types. But understand that when you're editing, there are forms that are unlocked. These mean that they haven't been used in calculations, as we've mentioned, and so they're not on your canvas already. And so if a form is unlocked, either it's a component or a place type or a building type, you're able to make changes to those components and then have those changes be part of what's factored into any calculations or any analytics that are run for your project area. If a component is locked, or if a place type is locked, or building type is locked, then it means that it's being used directly. But don't fear about being locked out. You're still able to save changes in a new version. So create a copy of that form and make changes to it, and then have that new form that you've created available for use throughout your project. Now, keep in mind that a component might be locked based on the fact that, an element, a built form element might be locked based on the fact that a component or a nested type within it is in use already. So if you are trying to paint with or look at a component that has look at a built form type that has a component in it that's already in use, then that built form type might already be locked. But as we mentioned before, you're still able to save a copy and make changes to that copy. All right, great. So at this point, you should be seeing our project on the screen. This is a buffered area around the downtown Berkeley BART stop. And for those of you that were able to, you could download the shapefile and create this project in UrbanFootprint on your own project application, so that you're able to open this up and follow along with what we're doing here.
Yeah, and before we go further, I'll say that this project shapefile is available online. You can go to our help site, look in the knowledge base, search for seminars, and you'll find the homepage for all of our seminars. And down at the bottom, there'll be a link where you can download this custom shapefile that we're going to be using for the purposes of this training course and is actually used in most of our training courses.
Right. Great. Yes. Thanks, Andy. So you'll see this is the way that you normally interface with a project when you open it up in UrbanFootprint. You're in Explorer mode, or you have the project information in front of you, and you want to get a better sense of the components that are in use, or make some custom components and built forms to specifically apply to your project. As we mentioned before, you can go to the built form manager along the mode options that are on the left side. And now we are in manage mode. We've gone through the overview, so you should have a good orientation of what manage mode consists of, or how to orient yourself through manage mode. So let's take a look first at components, since they're the building block of all the elements that we're going to use. In our Berkeley example, we are going to look at some housing considerations in Berkeley. As you've seen probably from some of our blogs and other conversations that we've had in UrbanFootprint, there's some housing challenges in California. And so we wanted to add some more housing opportunities by placing garden apartments in the Berkeley area. So if we take a look at the garden apartment component, there are actually 3, and we're looking at Court Bella in Irvine, California. This is basically a typology that we've created that's based on a real building, based on a real place, and we've added the characteristics of that project into UrbanFootprint so that it can be used as a component. So really quickly, we'll go over the built form cards to give you a better understanding of what all the card information is. So the first area is the component name. This is where you can interface with what characteristics the component names is made of, and just get a better understanding of any additional detailed information that we might have provided. So we can obviously see that this is a residential project, as you'd expect. It's located in Irvine, as you would also expect. You'll see that this element, this component, is locked because it's already in use. So none of this information can be changed, but at the same time, this is good basic information and background to have in place when you're looking at the component. The next is the component summary card. So this is one of the cards that's derived information, and actually it's calculated information from the characteristics that are provided in other cards. So this provides you, as summary would indicate, this provides you with an overview of the information that's available for this project. So the FAR, the floor area ratio, has been calculated along with density information, both in terms of population and employment. You'll see that there isn't employment information since this card is strictly residential. And if there's any parking allocation, parking density, all that information that's calculated based off of the other information that's provided in the card. The next card to take a look at is the site characteristic card. This is where you are able to allocate some of the features that are available in the card for your specific type. Now we'll take a look at this a little bit more in a place type, or excuse me, building type allocation, and how we make those changes. But be aware that you can make decisions on how much of the building footprint is part of the total site parcel area, how much parking is allocated, and how much non-hardscape and hardscape is a part of the building footprint. So these are all numbers that you typically expect for a residential space, so about 50% irrigated and 50% non-irrigated space on that site area. One thing to point out here is for these characteristic cards, you'll see a little checkbox at the top, meaning that all the information adds up appropriately. As you're making changes and you're making edits to these different characteristics, you may have miscalculated over allocated some information, under allocated some information. You'll see that there'll be a warning highlight on the areas that aren't added up correctly, and also there won't be a check mark on that card saying that that card is not accurate. Next, we'll look at the building characteristics card. This is where you get to determine, obviously, some of the elements of the building characteristics, but you're able to allocate space to either residential or non-residential, depending on if you're using a mixed use component. Also, the building height, that type of information, you're able to assign that. So if you are in an area where it's typical to have taller ceilings and taller floor heights, even if it's a 3-story building, you're able to make those types of changes there. If you needed to make those changes for a component and have that be included in any sort of place type or building type that you're creating based on components. And finally, the floor area allocation. This is essentially where you are making some design attributions to your space. So you get to determine if this is single family, what type of single family space it falls under. Same thing for multifamily, if there is any accessory dwelling, for example. Also, if you have non-residential uses in your space, you get to allocate more specifically the type of non-residential use. So if it's a mixed use space that's mostly going to have commercial, then you're able to put retail as the highest percentage of your employment sector, versus if this is a mixed use space that has office space that's included, then you get to include those types of elements. So that's the type of information that is all included in the floor area allocation card. So now that we've gone through these cards and have a better sense of how they're applied, let's go through an example of how we would actually make changes to or include these types of components into our paints by changing or creating a building type. So our next step is to look at building types. We mentioned that we wanted to try to increase the density slightly in Berkeley to allow for more housing. To do so, we start with a garden apartment, which is a type of use that's compatible and that would provide some additional housing opportunity in the area. You can see that the garden apartment building type is already locked. That's because it's already in use. Now, Berkeley does include some garden apartments, so since it's already on our canvas, we can understand that UrbanFootprint has already identified that garden apartments already exist. If we were to change the characteristics of garden apartments, it would change some of the summaries that we've already made in our calculations, and then that would change any outputs that we've already perhaps run or already included in our preliminary assumptions. It would change information on our base canvas, since garden apartments are already included in our base canvas calculation. So that's the reason why these components and types are already locked. Now to move past that, or to be able to use these characteristics as a starting point, you can do a save as function. So I click the save as button. The UrbanFootprint automatically creates this new type for me. So garden apartment new. So go ahead and save that. And UrbanFootprint calculates that information and creates that building type for us. Now you'll see that it populates directly below the building type that we were looking at initially. You'll see that it's also not locked, so it's available for us to make changes to. And the first thing I want to do is change the name. So garden apartments new was not very specific to me. We're working in our Berkeley project. We want to make a specific library for our Berkeley project here. And so garden apartment Berkeley is what I want to change the name to. You can save that change. And as you can see, it's still populated below our original building type, just based on alphabetical order, but it's taken the name change, and now that becomes a good starting point for us to change characteristics of this space. Now you can see that based on the building summary card, the floor area ratio is less than 1, meaning that this is probably close to a 2-story building with a lot of space allocated to parking. While that's a more efficient use of space, we wanted to try to increase some of the density so we could get more units into this space by making some changes there. So we're going to the component by land area card, which is something that's available in building types, and we're changing the allocation of those elements here. You can see that you can use the carets to move up and down and change the percent, but I kind of already have a sense of what I want to change this to, so I'm going to highlight and change that allocation. As I mentioned previously, when you start making changes, you've got a live running tabulation of the applicability of your card, and you can see that we're currently under allocated. Now I understand that because I've made these changes on purpose, but this will also function as a check for us if you're doing a character or a place type that has, or building type that has a lot of different characteristics, includes a number of different components, includes a lot of precise allocation. There's a possibility that you may miscalculate or may have added some information and not done the math completely. So this is a great check for you to be able to understand when you don't have a completed card, or when your information is not adding up the way you'd like it to. So you can see now that I'm under allocated by 50%. That's because I wanted to create some space for new components that I wanted to add. So I'm going to click Add Components, and now you have access to the full library of components that are available in UrbanFootprint. Now we already have a good selection of different components that are available. As we mentioned before, you can also create your own custom components by clicking Add New. But since I already have a sense of what I'm going after, I'm going to add some elements that I know already exist. So we're not trying to add a large amount of density in this area, but we do want to try to bump up the density of the building type that we already have included. So I'm going to go to my low-rise residential options. I'm going to add low-rise Avalon apartments. And I will also add low-rise Iron Horse family apartments. So the allocation card automatically applied my remaining allocation to the first component that I added, but I know I just want to distribute that evenly across the 2 components that I've added. So you'll see when my allocation was not equaling the appropriate total and was not 100%, there was an icon next to the save button that showed that this was not an element that was available for painting because this was not a complete building type. It was not 100% allocated. When I corrected that and I made a final allocation that was 100% of these different apartment types that I wanted to include in the characteristic of my new garden apartment for Berkeley, then this type was now available for painting. That warning icon was gone from the save button. Also, the warning icon in the component land area card itself also changed. and shows that we're at a total 100%. Now you'll see that because we are pulling from the characteristics of these different components that are already included, the component land area is the only area that we can make changes. So the area coverage is set. The site characteristics is made up of the elements from our existing components, so that's already set. Parking allocation, similarly, is already made up of components from our existing components, so that's already set. So that's a really quick and easy way to make those types of changes. If you wanted to, you could spend more time creating custom components that could then be pulled into a custom building type or a custom place type, or from building type to place type, and have a lot more control over all these elements. But just in reviewing the building summary card, I've already made the type of changes that I wanted to see. So our FAR is approaching 1.5, so this is probably closer to a 3-story building. You'll see what the population and the residential density is based on those changes. The parking allocation, the parking density, all of that matches a typology that I wanted to use specifically for my Berkeley example. So once that's completed, you can just hit save to make sure that all the changes that you've made are already included. And now the Garden Apartment Berkeley typology is ready for use. So let's go back to our project. And actually, let's move over to our scenario that we've created, where I've actually started to make some of the changes with a garden apartment typology that's similar to what we created as a custom place type, building type. We can zoom into our project a little bit further. And there are some areas that I think have a lot of single family housing, where if we're trying to increase the amount of housing and housing units that are available to us, then a garden apartment could be a nice compatible use with those single family housing, but still increase the amount of housing units and population in our area. So with that in mind, we can select a few strategic lots for our project. And then just like we would with any other painting exercise, which you've probably already done at this point or that you've seen from some of our previous videos, you can, in build mode, you can determine that you want to paint with building types. Scroll through the list of building types that are available that are organized in different categories. So we'll want to scroll down to the residential area. And as you are in the residential area, you'll see that Garden Apartment Berkeley is now an available option for us. You can also compare really quickly and see that it's a higher density than other garden apartments, and then also some of the other single family uses that you would see on our map. So now we select that information or select that building type in our menu, and you can see that already our paint preview menu is providing us with a quick overview of the type of changes that we'd be making if we painted with this type. So we'd be adding dwelling units, another 50% or so of dwelling units. We'd be adding a few more population members by adding this paint and a slight bit of employment as well. So I think I like those changes. Those are positive changes to make. And so I will hit paint. We'll make changes. And as I mentioned, this is in addition to some of the changes that I made already with a similar building type. And so now in our paint tracking chart, you can see that we have made an increase in population. We've increased our dwelling units. We've decreased our single family units, but we've more than made up for that in townhouses and multifamily. And so this is the type of change that we wanted to envision for our Berkeley project area so that we could help with the housing limitations in the area. So with that, you've made changes that you want to see. You're feeling comfortable about the changes that you've made across the board, across your project area. And now you want to just quickly get a sense for how those changes would impact your project area. Simply go to the report mode and pull up the information for both your base scenario and your new scenario that you created, in which you used your own custom place types and custom building types to make changes to the scenario. And now you can get a summary of this information that includes the increase in population. So we added nearly 2,000 or 1,500 people, I should say, to our study area just by some small select infill decisions to change some housing units to garden apartments. We've increased our number of dwelling units by about 1,000 dwelling units. And you can scroll down, as you're familiar with, for those that have experienced a lot of, or have done a lot of work and have some experience in urban footprint. You know some of the other elements that are included, including a distribution of household, a distribution of employment, which, as one would expect, hasn't changed too much since we were just adding more housing options and housing choices in the area. The dwelling use or dwelling units by type has obviously changed a good amount. And all that summary information is now available for you either as an export, or you can just show these images in your reporting to show the difference in the scenarios that you've changed. So that's a quick overview of your ability to use custom types, both in creating custom building types in this example, but then also customizing components or potentially customizing place types so that you can paint with accuracy and understand the impacts of those changes that you make based on your project area and your project considerations. So with that, we can take a moment here to see if there are any questions that have come in from those that are participating right now.
Yes, we have one question here. The question has to do with land use categories. So if you go back, I guess if you go back to manage, we can look at that field in, I believe it was building types.
Okay, sounds good. We'll go back to our example just so we can keep it consistent.
So the question here was, can you create your own land use category, or do we just have a defined list?
So that, I think they're asking about the land use categories by which the different types are organized. And if that's the case, then those are already in place. And so these are pretty standard across most of the planning practices. So those categories are largely in place already.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. If you have a follow-up question, feel free to type that in. Next question was sort of asking a general question, like how do the building and place types impact sort of other aspects of urban footprint? So we go through and we define components and aggregate those into building and place types. What is sort of the end result of that? How does that impact sort of the use of, how does defining those and using those in a project really impact the other aspects of urban footprint?
Sure, and I think it's probably easy to consider some of the reporting elements that come out of urban footprint when you run analytics. So these base characteristics are what analytics run against when we choose to run analytics in urban footprint, which is one of the benefits and one of the great elements of urban footprint. So when we are making changes, for example, with building types, and we went over the gross versus net area that building types versus place types cover, then we are setting up our analytics with a level of understanding of what information should be changed and what information should be calculated against. So you saw that in this example, I mostly applied a garden apartment typology to the paints that I made changes to. So you saw that in our output, when we looked at the reporting and summary stats, a lot of our economic output information in terms of employment and employment type, a lot of that stayed the same. Whereas a lot of the housing related, so dwelling units and population, that information we could see a reasonably large change in that information based on our decision with our components and with our place and building types. If we were to use a building type that had a mix of use, which is something that a lot of people like to see in terms of future scenarios, then obviously some of the underlying and base employment information would have changed. And then also you can think about how that would apply to the different analytics that are available in UrbanFootprint. So accessibility and walking distance would change based on the fact that we're adding new use types that people could have access to. So your household costs, energy use, those types of factors in analytics would change based on the fact that we are creating changes with our paint. So that's one framework and one way to take a look at that and consider that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, great answer there, Jason. I think that's all the questions we have right now.
All right. Well, thanks for your questions. And that ends our demonstration for today. We hope that this provided you with some good insight on how to, not only how to understand and how to make changes and use the built form manager to create your own types, but also some of the considerations of how to apply them and how to customize your projects to make precise types that you can then use for your projects and have the outcomes that you want to see in your projects.